Hi, my name's Kaleem Aftab, and I'm a film critic and programmer, and it's my tremendous pleasure today to be here with this panel that's very close to my heart, which is about the British Asian experience as related to film and how it's really changed, in my opinion, for the good recently. And to talk about this and whether I'm right or wrong, on the panel today, we've got Aleem Khan, whose new film After Love was selected for the Cannes label, but unfortunately with Cannes not happening. It's now showing at the London Film Festival as a world premiere. It's a great story about a Muslim woman, don't want to give too much away, who finds out secrets after a tragedy that crosses the channel. And then we have also Hardeep Pandhal, who's got this beautifully titled short 20-minute medium-length piece called Happy Thuggish Paki, which kind of plays on Paki and also video game culture, because the Paki comes from Pac-Man. It's not really what you're expecting, and shows a lot of different identities and heritage and how they influence who we are today. And finally, we have Dawinder Bansal, who has this beautiful art installation piece called Jambo Cinema, which she made off her own back, which really celebrates her youth and her family having a video shop that was also an electrical store, and how watching art, which we all love to do, really influenced her life and her cultural outlook. It's something I found interesting because all three of your work is so completely different. You would not really put them together, yet they all deal with double identities in some way, and in a beautifully different way that we all experience. I just want to know what your experience was before we talk about that, just growing up. What kind of films did you like? How did you view yourselves growing up?
I guess it's touched upon in the film. At the end of the film, there's a scene of me trying to recount the names of my peers at school, at secondary school. And I went to a boys' school, but it was a state-funded boys' school and in Birmingham. And yeah, it was predominantly, we would say BAME, other people would say POC or whatever. But yeah, so it was kind of like very much, very different to my, experiences of being at university, for example. I have one line which I sort of recount sometimes. It's like, I went to university to learn what it means to be a minority, because, the first half of my life was spent in a predominantly sort of Black and Asian kind of environment. And then the second half of my life, which is the time when I'm supposed to sort of, define who I am, I suppose, is different. And then I have to kind of like juggle my sort of experiences accordingly, or like sort of maybe negate one sort of side of me to kind of progress in some ways, but then that feels like some kind of, sort of doesn't feel right or something. But yeah, I listen to a lot of rap music, a lot of African American sort of influences. Played lots of video games. I still do. And sort of do the things that people do, I guess. But I guess in terms of like British Asian influences, I was thinking about this, and I think there were a few, not many. I remember Goodness Gracious Me being something that was quite significant. I was probably early teens, maybe, when that came out, so quite young. And I found that quite profound. And just in terms of how honest it felt, even though some of it, the problem with sort of these programs is that they can never really get to the nuance all the time, because it's such a diverse kind of like diaspora that we're talking about. But I felt some of the characters really did did feel quite close to like home, or like quite real actually, which was quite remarkable for a BBC program.
For sure. And Aleem, I saw you nodding along quite a bit there. I mean, what was your experience like growing up?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I didn't grow up in a kind of like film literate family. I mean, I was exposed to culture in the sense that my mum's English, my dad's Pakistani, and they would take me. Well, my mum specifically would take us kids to museums and stuff, and I was into drama and acting and all that kind of stuff. But we never really grew up with kind of I never really remember, like, as a young kid watching films or Bollywood really being kind of a factor in my home. But I think, I mean, a real turning point for me was when I saw East is East. That kind of came out, I think, in like 1999 or something. And I was about 14, I think, or 13 or something. And it was really powerful because my whole family were there watching it on Channel 4, I think. And we were watching ourselves. You know, this is a film about, you know, a mixed race family growing up as Muslims, and how the kind of kids are navigating that juxtaposition, I guess. And it was weird. It was weird because we were all watching this film knowing that that was us. And you know, there was it's a comedy, but there are real things in that film that are quite hard to see. And it was weird. We were all kind of sitting there watching it, and it was awkward but very binding at the same time. Anyway, that was like the first film I think I saw that I was like, okay, this is me. I'm seeing myself in this mirror. And like, same as like kind of Hardeep, I remember kind of watching Goodness Gracious Me. Like, my whole family would sit down and watch that, and kind of how these kind of traditionally held stereotypes are kind of inverted and kind of deconstructed through parody was incredible. But also just seeing brown people on TV, you know, was big. You know, I just didn't really have that. I think for me, like when I was kind of in college, it was seeing films like The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, and The Crying Game. These films quite politicized me in a way. And when I went to uni, you know, I was studying film, obviously, and I was kind of like Hardeep again, like was in a very white space. I grew up, I went to an all-boys state school as well, but it was pretty much all white. And I always struggled with this kind of, I always felt very othered, even in my own family, because I guess I'm gay, and growing up as a Muslim in a Muslim family in quite a dysfunctional, not immediate family, but a very dysfunctional extended family, was quite tough. And I didn't really have any role models or anyone to really kind of talk to. And when I went to uni, I was obviously experimenting with, well, not experimenting, I was discovering I was just kind of like, I was in acting, and I was finding my identity. And I remember seeing, taking out My Beautiful Laundrette on VHS, and I had this combi TV in my room. And it was so funny because I was like totally in the closet, and I took it, like in the library, you've got these kind of like spiral things like the VHSs, and I took it out and I took it to the librarian, and I was terrified of her seeing me take this film. I mean, she was a white woman, but I was terrified that somehow she was going to know that I was gay. And I remember getting back to my room, and literally, this sounds really pathetic, but I watched it under a blanket with a combi TV, and I saw this film. And it kind of blew my mind because it was the first time that I was seeing kind of gay Asian characters on screen. And also a thing about class as well. It was the first time I was really seeing British Asian people as middle class, or like living in quite fancy homes in West London. Like, my family, we're, you know, working class. My whole family are very working class. To be honest, I never really thought that existed, you know, people, Asian people kind of being middle class and kind of living in posh houses with like quite posh English accents. So that kind of like changed my kind of, just opened my mind a bit. And, you know, I kind of then just devoured a lot of Hanif Qureshi's kind of work and material and his plays and the films that he wrote. So, yeah.
That was totally amazing. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to come back to some of those points you raised, but I want to switch over to Dawinder, because obviously you lived my dream. You had like a video store. I mean, come on, that must have been the best youth ever.
it was and it wasn't. Like sometimes I'd get forced to watch stuff that we really didn't like, because it was like, you know, there was this whole like my film. There's a story that I explore about piracy, and me being one of the pirates as a 7-year-old girl, and so sometimes it was great in terms of watching, being exposed to so much sort of Punjabi films, Hindi films, Pakistani films as well, actually. And so I sort of had that influence from my parents of watching all of these Bollywood films. And then I also had the influence of watching a lot of, I think at the time, like when I was growing up in the 80s, there was a lot of American programs on TV, and there was like, you know, Magnum and Chips and, you know, like Knight Rider, all these programs that were just like, they were American programs, but they were fun, the A-Team. And, you know, there really wasn't, you know, anything in terms of sort of much representation of Asian communities on TV or anything. So I think the first time that I saw something that really did make me feel, and even though I'm not Muslim, it really made me feel like there's a part of my identity that's been explored, and that was the same as you, like on East is East. And, you know, I went to watch that film twice at the cinema when that came out, because I just found it I was just like, there's a real truth in this, and I really connect with it. And I really didn't realise at that point that how much connection I wanted to see of my own identity on the big screen. So I would say, but the other thing that like my parents used to watch a lot on TV was, I mean, all this stuff got banned anyway because it was really sexist, but the Benny Hill show was like a big thing in the house, and so it was like the carry-on films that were like really smutty, but like my parents used to like watching them. So and of course, because like I'm 20, my oldest brother is 20 years older than me, so I had lots of influences from what they were watching on TV and stuff, and those kind of musical influences that were vastly different to what my parents were listening to, and they were listening to a lot of music from the 1950s of India, so lots of black and white films and things like that, whereas my brothers would go to like Bruce Springsteen concerts, and you know, he was into rock and he played the guitar. So like there were lots of different influences growing up in my household. And then also sort of the African aspect of, as well, as my parents being born in India, then moving over to Kenya, and then coming over with that culture as well. And then, so it's kind of been a real melting pot of different cultures and influences.
I find it really fascinating that both you and Aleem mentioned East is East, because I must admit, when I first saw it, I hated that film. And I realise now that was part of myself being in denial of my existence. Like, I didn't want to belong to that. Even though I recognised everything that was going on, I lived it in a lot of ways, I didn't want that to be what defined me. Like, my heroes were all the other stuff. Like, I always go on about I wanted to be like Dallas Winston from The Outsiders, without thinking of those things. And so I really tried to identify myself with the mainstream of British culture at that time, or American culture, as we all did, because American culture somehow felt closer to my existence, possibly your existence, from listening to what you talk. So I was wondering who your heroes were and whether they showed some sort of confusion in identity.
I was going to add, actually, I was really interested in Prince Naseem as well, the boxer, because even because it's strange because he was from Yemen, so he's a Arab sort of background, but then particularly in a boys' school, you'd find the Indians and the Pakistanis sort of like looking up to this figure, and also because I guess he was sort of quite small, the featherlight boxer, but very sort of confident and kind of like yeah, his style was sort of very flamboyant as well. And he used to come out with these leopard sort of skin trunks and things. And I think it was quite unwittingly sort of camp in a strange way, and quite sort of like grotesque now looking back at it all as well. But I think, yeah, and it taps into sort of what you're talking about in terms of class. And I think his, yeah, his upbringing as well. I was reading about that recently, and it just, yeah, it seems to sort of, it's a kind of part of like sporting history that I don't think has kind of been fully, you know, digested or something. It was really significant, and but it was also like an accident. There wasn't really anyone directly from my heritage, really. But it was like visibly, optically, sort of made sense. And I think that kind of, yeah, the way that works is interesting.
He's a great hero to have, Prince Naseem. Very crazy character. Changed boxing, made lots of people have loads of money, who boxers that followed him. First huge cable deal. It's interesting that, because whenever someone broke free, we all really latched onto it. It seems like East is East for you guys, but for me, I must admit, it was My Beautiful Laundrette as well that I really latched onto. But more so, there was a TV series of Buddha of Suburbia. I love that show so much. That was the key one for me. I was wondering, Dawinder, was there something that was key for you that was different, or was there kind of who were the British and American figures you admired?
Well, I'm just thinking about this. I think in terms of where I'm based, and in terms of another Asian woman who really has, I feel, broken through and actually created a lot of opportunities for other women, it's going to sound very obvious, but is Meera Syal. Because I remember her in not Goodness Gracious Me, and the other one, The Real McCoy. I remember her in The Real McCoy, and I remember thinking, oh, there's an Asian woman here. What is she doing there? And then, of course, you know, like I think a few years later, Goodness Gracious Me started. But I think in terms of being able to write about stories and really owning your heritage and your identity and making it very relatable, I think that's what's very key for me, because anyone who watches, say, for example, like the film that we've made, anyone who watches that will get an essence of themselves within it. And I think my heroes really are the kind of people that can take something very specific and make it universally relatable. So I think from a person who's like, she's been a writer, she's an actor, you know, and being able to do that at the time that she did it in was quite groundbreaking.
Incredibly groundbreaking, and everything, you know, all those TV shows, all those films that she was in, and the way that she carries herself as well, and the incisiveness. That was, I mean, I think for everyone, Goodness Gracious Me was the first show where people kind of stood up and showed British culture up. Rather, yeah. It was featured Asians, but it was about British culture. And I think that's what's interesting about the work that you guys are doing, is really about Britain as much as it's about anything else. How do you see Britishness in your work? And if all of you can answer that, that would be great for me.
How do I see Britishness in my work? I guess, it's a weird one. It's not a weird one, it's a normal question. It's just kind of weird to articulate it in a, I guess for me, a lot of my work, all of my work actually is kind of, it's always been inspired by my family. It's always been inspired by something that's happened in my family or whatever. And I think with After Love, you know, my new film, it was definitely inspired by my mum. You know, my mum and my dad met on a council estate in Walthamstow, and they'd been together since they were 13 years old. And, you know, they moved to Kent where I was raised. And they went through a very, very difficult time when they first got together, you know, from the stories they tell me, you know, fireworks through the door and all that. And also just family pressures, you know, from my dad's side, especially kind of. And I think my mum, you know, my mum converted, I guess, in order to marry my dad. You know, she became a Muslim, and, you know, a very devout Muslim. You know, she was, you know, Shulwakanese, and, you know, learned how to cook curry, and, you know, learned how to speak Punjabi. And I think that kind of transformation was something, or that kind of code switching is something that I always really connected with, like, because I think one, you know, being raised as like mixed heritage, but then also being gay, it's like kind of what part of yourself do you turn on and off in depending on what spaces that you're in. And you know, I also, like, there was a point when I was 19 at uni, it was quite a hard time. Like, I was really, because, you know, before I went to uni, I went to Mecca and with two of my uncles, and for me it was really about me trying to find, I became very religious, like ultra religious, you know, stopped drinking alco pops, stopped eating like ham slices, and you know, became like very religious and very devout, and was praying, and I think when I look back at that, that was really about me trying to find a clan or a tribe. And when I went to uni and I got my first boyfriend and like had sex for the first time, it was kind of like, oh, okay, this is something that is really who I am. And I think I was going through quite a difficult time away from my family. I went to uni in London, and so I was close enough to feel safe and close to my family, but far enough to kind of really find my own identity in a way. And during that time, my mum was also, I think, having a lot of difficulties with her own identity. There was a lot of shit going on in the family, and I think that was really making her question like the decisions that she made for my dad, and you know, this metamorphosis that she had gone through, and was really grappling, I think, with like who the hell she was. And so I think I think that was really the seed for After Love, really, was this wanting, that desire to explore where identity comes from, how we construct it, and who we are construct our identities for. And so I was very kind of obsessed with this question. And in a way, you know, the story of After Love isn't autobiographic in the sense that my dad isn't dead. I don't have half siblings in Calais, I don't think. But the kind of the deeper questions around grief and losing a child, and what is left of ourselves when the person who has deceived us, or what is left of ourselves when we lose someone, someone is no longer there. How do we recalibrate who we are when our identity is so fixed to someone else? That really is very central in me, and it's something that obviously, you know, I'm very comfortable in my identity now, but growing up, it was like a real fire to be walking through. So I can't even remember the question. I've just gone off on some tangent, but like, yeah, Britishness. I didn't actually answer your question.
You know what? It's very weird because I actually feel you answered the question in such a great way, because
okay.
the question you just answered in a way that just spoke to me about our normal lives, that are lives that are every day. All of the things you talked about didn't have anything to do with how you grew up. They talked about what identities mean, what it means to try and please someone, what love means, what our adolescence means. And these are questions that everyone faces. And that's something I've struggled with. And this is why I think I raised the question of Britishness, and I'll bring it Hardeep and Dawinder in, is I struggled in because a lot of the art that I was watching, a lot of the cinema I was watching, was telling me that my experience was a desire to be British white, because it was films that were romance films, which were on the surface very liberal, and this is where I had a bit of a problem with East is East, but actually it was a striving to reject everything to please something else, which I don't think anyone ever does fully. They have 2, 3, we all walk around with 4 or 5 identities, and we play different parts in different parts of the world, and different characters that we play depending on who we're talking to. So that's what I really loved about your question, because you went off on a tangent, and the answer, you just went off on a tangent, and it captured all of that very beautifully. So I want to jump in, because that was such a full answer. I want to ask Hardeep about your own kind of experience of watching cinema in particular, but any kind of visual art, television, and whether that made you angry and frustrated, what you were seeing.
As in, like, just generally, like, my whole life, or sort of, yeah, I don't know. I think, yeah, I guess, like, I went to art school, but my parents, neither of them have been to university. My brother, you know, he's a doctor now, but he did medicine. He's older, so he fulfilled the wish of the family and became a doctor, which left me the sort of license to do whatever I wanted, I suppose. So yeah, I think, like, I've had to kind of learn it a lot myself. There was no going to the galleries. There was no sort of family members sort of encouraging me to, like, pursue art or anything, and there still isn't at all. It's kind of it's a complete sort of, like, other world to them. And the problem, yeah, lots of problems arise. I think it's kind of has been considered, and, you know, been suggested that such a pursuit is an effeminate pursuit, and there's the questions around sort of, like, you know, betraying one sort of, like, you know, sacrifice in terms of, like, coming to the country, you know, working hard and, you know, getting your head down and just, like, as you say, like, chasing the sort of the British dream, whatever the hell that is. I don't know. Yeah, so it's a strange thing. And I think, yeah, the idea just generally, like, just pursuing it as a kind of contemporary art, as a serious kind of career, is in itself, you know, you will come up against a lot of sort of, you know, things that are going to be displeasing, and sort of not through intention, just because you know that there's privileges that aren't there for you, basically. And you see it in other people, you see it with your peers and stuff. My mum doesn't speak any English either, and this is something that I've kind of referred to a lot in my work. And even just, you know, trying to explain that to some of my friends. And I should also point out that I have a lot of, like, you know, very important sort of white working class friends that I've grown up with and shared these experiences with. But you get a sense that, yeah, the sort of it isn't designed. The sort of course, the structure isn't designed basically to accommodate you. It's designed to assimilate you, basically, and in some sense. I'm quite sort of, for want of a better phrase, quite eclectic when it comes to things. But I'm also quite, like, I'm into sort of very trashy things as well. Like, I don't watch, like, a lot of film. Actually, I read more nowadays than I do. I watch a lot of anime now. I play lots of video games now. A lot, you know, I watch, yeah, like, sort of TV shows and things like that. I was really into Sopranos. I'm currently watching the podcast that they're doing now over COVID, the Talking Sopranos podcast. Yeah, I think I try to, when it comes to sort of, like, and film festivals as well, I don't really go to film festivals, so it's a bit different for me, this kind of context. But, you know, I went through like the sort of art school. There's kind of an initiation where you sort of watch, you know, a bunch of, like, French films, a bunch of, like, you know, Fassbinder and sort of all these kinds of things, which kind of, like, maybe, you know, get you thinking about what cinema is and where you can go with it. But, you know, I sort of stick to one or two things, and, like, really just, like, I'm quite slow when it comes to, like, consuming things. Actually, I can't just, you know, sit there and watch tons of films. You know, like, I can't imagine what it'd be like to sort of be, you know, a panelist or someone on a adjudicator, you know, watching tons of films for these festivals. It would drive me mad. I just want to read, you know, a couple of things, focus on, like, a few ideas, and then just, like, yeah, have time to work on that. And I think that's maybe I guess it's a different process for, you know, an artist filmmaker, as opposed to a filmmaker working with a bunch of people, a crew, and a sort of infrastructure that supports that, maybe.
You would so hate my life. It would be like a nightmare. The constant watching of films and, like, loving and pontificating that I do is incredible. Dawinder, can you tell me about the use of identity in your work? Because obviously on the surface, it seems to be front and center, but the way you deal with it is much more surreptitious. There's elements of, yes, this world is a video shop world, but it's a British world as well. And you're struggling with, there's a whole outside going on that is almost like just outside the frame as well. very interesting how you do that.
Yeah, I don't think, I really feel like I owned both identities when I was growing up, apart from when I started to become a teenager, and then that was it, when you're sort of very aware of who you are, and then it's like going shopping and being really embarrassed that your mum can't speak English and that she's not wearing, you know, English clothes, and, you know, not being able to fit in, and that kind of thing really standing out. And I you know, I was very aware of things at that point, and sort of cooking at home, and then all of a sudden the sort of the smell clinging to your clothes, and you're going out and people are like, oh, what's going on, you know, what's that smell? And so I think I just feel in many ways I feel quite lucky. I feel really lucky to have all this identity, but then sometimes because I really feel like I've been able to pick and choose the best of everything that I've encountered, and I try to leave everything else behind. And all of my work, every single story that I've explored, all of my work, it's really stuff that's been on my doorstep, because I think that there's so many stories on people's doorsteps, and particularly in grassroots working class communities, and I don't think a lot of that's explored as well. And for me, because my mom has never been able to speak good English, it's meant that I've had to learn Punjabi really well. And what that's also meant is that I'm able to go out into communities and speak to other older Asian women. And I've done projects with them. So I did I did Jambo Cinema, then I did another project which was called Mother Tongues from Fatherlands, which was interviewing like 50, 60 Asian elder women and making a brand new theatre show with their stories. And then there was a seed from that which grew, which was about Asian women and cars. And that was a film that I made last year, which was all about the first generation of Asian women who learnt to drive, who weren't always allowed to drive because of patriarchal family structures. And the project that I'm currently working on is We Found Love in the 80s. And that isn't specific to the Asian community. That's about all couples who fell in love in the 80s. But the theme there being about them overcoming obstacles, whether that be a mixed race relationship, gay relationships, anything that was difficult in accordance to societal norms. So I always want to explore those invisible stories that, you know, are really human. And I think that I've been very fortunate of being, you know, Asian and a woman and British and Kenyan and all of those other bits of identity. I almost feel like I've owned all of that now, and I feel like I can go outside into the big world and explore other people's stories from different cultures and different communities. Like I was always so when I got to that teenage period, I was kind of really ashamed of my name because people could never pronounce it properly, and they were like, oh, can I just shorten it to this? Can I shorten it to that? Can I call you Davina instead? Or can I call you Dee instead? Or, you know, those types of things. And then when I was doing some research into my history and what my name actually means, and the fact that I'm Sikh, but it's a unisex name. And so it's really about equality. And that for me was about like the first time I really felt like my name is actually really important. So, you know, little things like that keep on happening for me, where there's another sort of addition to being proud of my heritage.
Yeah, like similar sort of thing connected, I suppose. But I used to work in a call centre when I graduated from my first degree. And I remember sort of like always, you know, when I have to introduce myself, my name is Hardeep such and such. You know, this person on the other end of the line would be like, what's your name? Hardy. And I'd be like, no, it's Hardy. It's 2 words, hard and deep. And then they would never say anything after that because it's just like a sort of, there's a sort of like innuendo sort of thing going on there. But yeah, I definitely think like when it's your name, it's never going to, and you know, you can't conceal the color of your skin either. You're marked really. So it's not the same, you know. It's something that you kind of have to just deal with from birth, basically. And I think for me at school, when you know, very young, it was kind of all right, actually, because you're sort of surrounded by people who look like you, essentially, or have names similar to yours. there was another Hardeep in my class, but that would never happen in sort of where I am now. Maybe it will, but I don't know. Yeah.
And did you when you approached your work, did you see, even with the title of your work, have you, you're playing on this idea of being proud of something, like going, you can't shame me by having this idea that's going to embarrass me. Was that something that was important to you?
Yeah, I think, I think there's like a fear, or constant fear, that because of the way I am, my attitude, or the way I talk, my name and all this stuff, that people will be threatened by that or something. There's always a fear that I'm going to threaten someone, particularly in the art world. I don't know what it is. I think it's because of the things that I'm interested in, or I cite as references in my work, like things like video games, or rap music, or pornography. These are things that are like, looked sort of as pathologically sort of like, other, or not to be sort of, dealt with seriously. They're kind of considered things that are, that will possess you, essentially. But I kind of play off it as well. And there's an aspect of performance which is quite important. So it's kind of owning that performative element and, sort of playing with it at the right time, at the right place. Yeah, and I think, with in my sort of field, I think you don't have to, I believe that you don't really have to, the work should speak for itself, really. I don't think you should have to, perform in this kind of like way all the time. I think it's not really great, but there is that sense that it's becoming more and more a requirement, with things like social media and, people constantly wanting that kind of, that sort of soundbite, that kind of quick fix of a sort of positive thing, or something that they can get through quickly. It's important, but I'm trying to resist that, because it can sort of oversimplify things. And I think complexity and nuance are things that should be sort of like really sort of valued. And I think, and this also comes into sort of like my belief that anyone can make art and anyone can understand it. I don't think that that we need to patronize and sort of humiliate our sort of audiences by giving them things that are oversimplified.
We're kind of running out of time, so I just want to throw open a question to you all. I feel like we're at a new moment where the type of art and the stories that we're allowed to tell are different, and we are telling different stories, and we're not hiding our past, and we're much more open. What do you think it is about the present and now that's enabled that? I know that's a really tough question to answer.
I think it's one of the things for me, it's about having greater visibility and greater role models. I guess increasing a number of role models in the arts. I mean, I think of someone like Riz Ahmed, for example, who is a really, obviously incredibly talented and intelligent and decent person, but he's kind of broken into the mainstream in a way that I think a lot of people before him haven't been able to. And he's also, I think what's more important is that he's playing roles that aren't like specific to his kind of ethnic background. Like he's playing roles called John or, Peter or whatever, it's, and I think that is really important because, we all have stories that aren't necessarily, we all have stories that are kind of obviously related to our kind of cultural, religious, ethnic backgrounds, but actually we also have other stories that we don't want to kind of just be kind of a prisoner to that. Like we all we want to be able to express ourselves outside of that, that framework as well. I think also there's just been a kind of a bit of a sea change in, I think, the gatekeepers. I mean, this is still a massive problem in the industry, that the gatekeepers that give us space or give us finance or whatever to kind of tell our stories. I think there's always been a kind of, what's the word? Like there's always been a kind of a history where the work that we are allowed to tell is actually, yes, we're making the work, but it's actually just a continuation of the narratives that they feel comfortable us putting out about ourselves, if that makes sense. And I think now we have more agency to say, actually, there's a term that Hanif Qureshi called, I'm going to forget what it's called now, the burden of representation, or the brown man's burden, which is like always like looking at I guess it's referring to the pressures that kind of Black or Asian practitioners to present their ethnic minorities or their histories in a way that is very kind of palatable, or very positive, or kind of syrupy or kind of sweet. And I think that's because so much of how we are represented on screen or in culture, in media, is within a very specific prism. I think there's often been the need to kind of only show the kind of the positives or the good side of our kind of backgrounds. And I think now we're in a space where actually we can show the dirty stuff, like we can show the stuff that's dark, we can show the stuff that actually we are ashamed of. And I think that is something that has kind of evolved, like the nuances of our histories and our stories, I think are able to kind of be presented more clearly. Don't know if any of that made sense, but it kind of did to me, but yeah.
It totally made sense. But I was going to add to that as well. What I've then found funny is the things that have been most like we've been shaming ourselves about, or we feel shamed about, are actually the things we put out into the culture, and people are like, oh yes, yeah, okay, I get that. And they want to move on with, and they understand it much more than I've ever felt it would be understood, because the experience is so universal. And that's what I find is like, our experience is the experience, and the experience has grown, and it's not just British Asian. We could have had this conversation with Eastern Europeans or African British film. And it would have been the same stories. There's a unity that's growing out, and that's the beauty now. I think that's what everyone's seeing. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but Aleem, Hardeep, Dawinder, it's such a pleasure to chat to you guys. So many interesting ideas, positives, hearing your stories. Thank you so much.